It feels like the middle class are being asked again to bear the brunt of this extended SST and I think in many ways the past financial mismanagement of the country. So what message do you have for them? Because they're going to, come July 1st, find out that a lot of things are more expensive.
Actually, Xiaoning, interestingly enough, I think you're against the middle classes more than me. And the reason I say that is that actually...
I'm Wong Xiaoning and this is the Breakfast Grille. Come July 1st, a whole list of our items like selected fruit, fish and even services like hairdressing will suddenly become more expensive due to an expansion of the sales and service tax. As things stand, many households are already struggling with the cost of living. So why has the government decided to introduce this, and is its implementation confusing, especially for businesses? Questions we pose to the Secretary General of the Treasury, Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican, whilst we also get a preview of Budget 2026 and the state of the government's finances. Johan, thank you for coming on the show. We appreciate that despite your busy schedule, you willingly accepted our offer.
Not at all.
To come in and explain the SST.
So BFM calls saya menurut perintah,
Oh, I love that. Okay, we will call you again on after
For
October
sure.
10th.
Very happy to be here. Thank you, Shani.
So let me start you easy, I'll ease you in.
Yes, thank you.
By asking, why has the government decided to expand the SST framework? How much money are we going to raise?
Maybe, Shani, let me give you a slightly broader context. I think, as you know, under the Madani government coming in, I think one of the issues was the government had inherited an unsustainable fiscal position. And I think one of the commitments of the Prime Minister was to undertake a broader set of fiscal reforms as part of the economic Madani framework. So if we're going to raise the ceiling in terms of transforming the economy, raise the floor in terms of the rakyat's well-being, we certainly need to have a fiscal position that can support that on a sustainable basis. And you've seen a consistent implementation of a reform agenda. We discussed before coming on air about Fiscal Responsibility Act, a gradual reduction in our fiscal deficit, targeted subsidies. We'll be speaking about RON. And this is perhaps the next part of it in terms of widening our tax base. So as you're probably aware, Malaysia probably has one of the lowest tax to GDP at about 12.5%. I think probably only Indonesia is lower than Malaysia in this region. So certainly there's a need to expand the tax base. But more importantly, as we set out in the Economy Madani, there are many things that we need to do better for the rakyat, and hence we do need that wider revenue base. This includes, like for example, this year we expanded the SARA program, where we allow them to, from their ICs, allowed to buy basic goods. I think there's a focus. I think on Prime Minister focuses a lot on the basics, fixing the school toilets, 8,000 of them. This year we have extra 400 million to fix dilapidated clinics, infrastructure like rural roads.
Yeah, less so on mega projects,
yes,
right?
I think that was a clear message in Budget 2025, no mega projects, but really trying to address these things. And so you do need a revenue base. And I think the other one that's important to highlight, particularly in this environment of increased global uncertainty, we certainly would need to be prepared in terms of having some fiscal buffers or space to cover for eventualities going forward.
So I need to know the details. How much more are you going to raise? I mean, if we look at it from a percentage of GDP perspective, right? I think if we look at GST during the regime, it was about 3% of GDP? From what I gather, the previous SST before the expansion of the list was about 2%. So are we making up that shortfall? Is it enough?
No, I think the total collections of SST is approximately, I think it's crossed 2% of GDP. Last year in 2024, we clocked in about 45 billion collection for SST. During the time it was implemented, GST was north of 3%. And so, you'll be talking about, again, north of 60-something billion. So if, for example, we had implemented GST, we would possibly, on an annualized basis, be able to collect north of 20 billion. What the government has done under the expansion of the SST is actually less than half of that. So on an annualized basis, we're targeting around 10 billion to be raised. So in that sense, it's also, I think, as what you may have heard from Prime Minister speaking over the weekend, I think government is trying to approach it in perhaps a more gradual approach, feeling that GST would be too broad-based and in terms of its burden on the rakyat. Hence this more targeted approach which attempts to balance, on one hand, as we discussed earlier, the need to raise revenues, but at the same time also mitigating the potential impact on the typical man on the street.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that logic about whether it's better for the rakyat, the SST versus GST. But I want to ask you about the list of items and the services. Because, Johan, I downloaded the 222-page long Federal Government Gazette. And the list is honestly so extensive. I kind of gave up reading after a while. But some oddities in there stood out. Camel, dolphin meat, a very long list of seafood and fruits like bananas. I mean, who decided on this list?
Well, funnily enough, if you look through the GST list, it would be much, much longer. But I think the approach as articulated by Prime Minister in Budget 2025 is that we wanted to obviously expand the revenue base, but do it in a way that is more progressive and mitigates the impact on the average person. And therefore, one of the key focus areas in revising the SST is that we try to ensure that basic goods remained at 0%.
Yes. So your rice and sugar or palm oil,
chicken, meat, cooking oil, bread. So all the basic goods we maintain at 0%. And what we then tried to look at is what would then be items that we could increase to 5%. A lot of them, perhaps some are processed food, some are more. I guess you've seen the list of seafood,
oil, salmon, cod, for example.
Yes, so if
but yet not tilapia. So you see what I mean?
But tilapia is seen as a very local something that's perhaps more for the masses, so that remains at 0%. So whereas cod is not seen to be for the masses, hence that's at 5%.
But what about bananas, for example, which are everybody eats? I mean, of course we have local fruit.
Yes.
But of course there's questions about, is there enough of it? Is it at the right price? Things like this. So my point is, what's the guiding principle? Is it just really somebody in MOF saying, I eat this, so this must be for the masses? Was there some numbers to it?
No. Certainly we went through, and perhaps you're right, there's an element of judgment, but certainly the intent is really to ensure that basic items will not increase in terms of SST. And when you speak about fruits, so perhaps there has been some confusion over the issue of fruits, but just to clarify, all locally grown fruits are not subject to sales tax. It is only on imported fruits.
Which a lot of Malaysians consume, be it the M40, B40, T5, T15, whichever category, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, that's why I say it sometimes seems a bit arbitrary.
But the intent is really to ensure that at least there's a wide range of basic goods. We believe that there is a lot of choice in terms of ensuring that the typical household still is able to access a wide range of basic goods which are not subject to sales tax, whether, milk products, you got milk specifically, you have, again, we spoke about rice, all the basic items.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when we looked through in terms of its potential impact, I think you may have seen reports like, I think it was a CIMB report which estimated the potential impact on inflation to be about 0.25%. That's even potentially slightly higher than our in-house estimate.
I'll come to the sensitivity analysis in a minute. Yes. But I do want to ask you about this glaring item under item 25.01, Johan.
Yes.
Salt. And even seawater.
Okay, so
what is that all about? Why are we having tax on seawater?
So I think the issue sometimes is that I think the Gazette, and maybe this I have to apologize. The Gazette is really a document meant for perhaps it's a technical document.
Okay.
And maybe perhaps best understood by those in industry.
Sorry, then you have the occasional nerd like me looking at it.
So under the salt, as in the cooking salt that all households use, that use in your kitchen, that's at 0%. However, the more premium salt, so like table salt, that's at 5%. And under table salt, you have this item called seawater, but actually that is a technical term that refers to a saline solution used for the pharmaceutical sector. So if you decide to go down to Port Dickson and scoop some water, that certainly is not subject to sales tax. But it's a specific.
Bring back water from the Pacific Ocean. That's fine.
The bare price of description is unfortunate, but it does refer to specific manufacturing input for the pharmaceutical sector.
Now the list is so extensive. Should we be looking at what is excluded, which is its own 104-page document? I mean, it just kind of confuses, let's say, an individual who wants to know what items are included and what items are excluded? Should we just assume everything is included?
No, certainly not everything is included. So I think it's at least 15% of tariff line items that are that are excluded at 0%. And this is in line again as what we've mentioned to ensure that basic goods are not subject to sales tax. And perhaps maybe the other way of reading, rather than trying to go through the 11,000 tariff lines, and you do need that because customs. This is a tax. As you know, sales tax is a tax that's imposed at the point of local manufacture, and also at the point of importation. So there does need to be a definitive and exhaustive list as items enter the country, whether or not it's subject to tax and at what rate. But I guess in terms of at the high level, what is being proposed when the dust settles is an increase in sales tax, not less than 20%. So it's not something that, as some may have suggested, a doubling or tripling of the incidence of sales tax.
But are we going to resign ourselves to an inevitable increase in the cost of living and in tandem inflation from this expanded SST? Because and especially for lower income households, because 70% of their expenditure in a B40 household is usually spent on daily necessities. And there's no doubt that some of this cost will trickle down into the supply chain.
So actually there was due care in looking at what needed to remain at 0% by going through the consumer basket or the CPI, what was in the CPI index. And I think for that reason, that's why as some external analysts have estimated around 0.25% impact on inflation. We think it's potentially even lower. But having said that, this
what's your
is
number
something
at MOF? I'm sure you've done the sensitivity
so
analysis.
we're closer to 0.2. But what we're saying is that we do expect that based on what the budget target for this year, inflation between 2.5% and 3.5%, we don't expect to exceed that. In fact, at current trends, we do expect to be at the lower end of that range, even with our revision of sales and service tax.
Let's talk about some of the issues that the tax consultants have brought up. Not me, because I'm not an expert, but according to them, an inherent weakness of SST is the cascading effect because of the absence of credit for taxes paid in previous stages of the supply chain. Has that been addressed?
So you're right. I think one of the issues of SST is the potential for tax on tax. But I guess philosophically, I think that's also what Prime Minister had explained over the weekend, that one of the reasons why he chose SST as opposed to GST actually enables all input tax faced by business to then be passed on to the next consumer. Next consumer is a business, they also be able to claim that. And so really, GST is 100% fully borne by the final consumer, and that's the rakyat. And I think the view of this current government, it wanted a tax where it is to be borne by those better able to be borne. And it's almost by design, hence, that when we do SST, that some of the burden is taxed at the level of the businesses as opposed to the consumer. So that's part of the
businesses are
that's
like,
part
right?
of the philosophy. Okay.
They aren't going to sit by and say, yes, let's have lower profit margins. They are going to find ways to say, I want to keep my profit margins. You consumers, sorry, I'm going to pass it on.
Okay. But that may be so, but some of the businesses certainly are some of the, at least for the services, like say, even when we impose one of the new sectors is for financial services, we've already exempted basic banking services, typical, your interest on your housing loan. So that's all exempt. The ones that have been incurred are more fee-based, merchant banking, those sort of things which are more really businesses' income, fee-based income, probably more for the high income, like fund management and the like. But coming back to this issue about tax on tax, I think we're quite conscious about this issue. So for example, in introducing service tax for, say, rental and also construction. We have introduced what we call B2B exemptions. So you can imagine if there is a main contractor and its client, and below that, as typical in the industry, you have a subcontractor, and below that subcontractor, another subcontractor. So for those layers of subcontractor to subcontractor to the main contractor, those are exempt. There'll only be, in construction, service tax applied at one level, and that's from the main contractor to its client. So we have that built in as part of the exemptions to mitigate the potential impact on tax. For manufacturing, we already have in place currently under sales tax where inputs are basically registered manufacturers basically get an exemption from their input. So for their raw materials, if there's sales tax on raw materials, they can get an exemption for that as part of their process. So to the extent that under this expansion of sales tax, we've introduced sales tax on, say, machinery, So that exemption will be extended. So then not just for raw materials, but also in terms of the machinery that they acquire for their manufacturing process, that will be exempted to also then reduce the potential impact of tax on tax.
Yeah, but the tax experts also say that the exemptions are too limited in these B2B circumstances, or maybe due to existing business arrangements, that's not possible. So I'm curious, how much stakeholder engagement was there before this SST announcement? Because let me tell you, and I'm sure you're reading the headlines, almost every business group is protesting. SME Association, FFM, Steel Industry, Retail Association, they're not happy. They're all saying that there's going to be an increase in the cost of doing business, and in turn, cost of living for all of us.
Okay. Now, leading up to introduction of this revision in sales and service tax, as you know, we initially targeted for the 1st of May. But actually what has led to perhaps starting 1st of July instead was really the direction to really do further engagement. We focused a lot of our stakeholder engagement with the tax experts, the tax community, given that they have the perspective of a lot of clients, and certainly we engage with all the the leading firms and even the tax professional associations in really developing, and certainly there were inputs which they provided, and even on top of that we did engage associations. We did engage. I know the likes of FMM are not entirely happy, but certainly there were multiple engagements with them, and perhaps we may not have approved all of their requests, but certainly that process of engagements did lead to some specific exemptions. For example, in our engagement with the agriculture sector, we then took heed of their inputs, and therefore part of the list of 0% sales tax, includes 0% on fertilizer, 0% on insecticide, which were major inputs for that sector. So certainly the engagement was done. Many inputs which were received during this engagement did influence the final design of the SST, but certainly we were not able to accommodate all of those requests, because again we come back to the point of ultimately we did need to increase our revenue base, and we did our best in terms of trying to balance between the need for revenue and also trying to mitigate the impact on the final consumer.
Okay, so I understand that the government could consider enhancements to the exemptions, and I think this is because FM2, our finance minister too, had said so. Under what circumstances and how practical is the government prepared to do so? Because the deadline for this expanded SST is just 2 weeks from now.
No, so on one hand, the effective date for the SST expansion is 1st of July. But part of that is the expansion of 6 new sectors or services
like
under
hairdressing.
the service tax. And under this expansion, what you basically have is that for companies which are not currently registered, what the process that would happen is that in the month of July, which is the first month of it becoming effective, those companies, particularly in the new areas of service tax, would then have to determine, do they meet the revenue threshold, whether it's $500,000 for in general, but for 1.5 million for specific sectors like construction. If they do meet or they have sales above the threshold, then they would then have to register by August. And so then their first invoice, which would have service tax for a new registrant, would then be only in the month of September.
So everybody gets some time, at least those companies who don't have SST registration, in other words.
Yes.
Okay, does this expanded SST list then effectively mean that GST is dead?
I think what the Prime Minister said, that certainly the government does not see or a readiness to implement GST at this time. And so the government has opted for this SST, an SST which has been implemented on a more progressive and targeted approach. And as mentioned, I think the philosophy of the current government is, how do we ensure that to the extent that we do need to raise taxes, that burden of tax should be those who are better able to carry that tax, and hence this targeted approach. So I believe that is at least the current position for now.
Now, the Rakyat are going to do their part by paying more tax via this SST. But what is the government doing? Are you all cutting spending and walking the talk by making some hard decisions? I mean, I think one big one would be the Raw 95 subsidy rationalisation. I mean, that's not cost savings on your part, but perhaps part of that fiscal reform.
Again, as I started off, this certainly is a government that's been consistent in recognising the need for fiscal reform and has effectively sequenced a series of fiscal reforms, starting from the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It has already done in terms of the targeting of subsidies for electricity, increased water tariffs, diesel. We've removed the subsidies on chicken and eggs, although in a way that still maintains the stability of prices of those items. And certainly the next one in our planning is RON 95. But in addition to that, the government and has been very committed in terms of also but even in the targeting of subsidies, one of the recurring themes is how do we reduce leakage?
Yes.
It's not about really withdrawing subsidies from the rakyat. And if you've seen that even for electricity subsidy, more than 80% of households do not see an increase in electricity tariffs, and that has been consistent since the implementation of
So how
the targeting
successful
of
have you been
subsidies.
on leakages? Because that's a major consideration of many voters, right?
Yes. So even for diesel, what we did when we increased the diesel price up to market, we maintained the subsidized price for the logistics sector to mitigate the impact on inflation. That's why inflation last year was still maintained at around 2%. But what we achieved was savings of more than half a billion a month, because the leakage of sales of subsidized diesel to industry, sale of subsidized diesel crossing across the border, that certainly was mitigated judging by the savings that we achieved. And similarly for RON 95, the commitment by government is at least 85% will not face an increase in prices. This again is about reducing leakage so that whether it's foreigners, high income, businesses, those who should not be benefiting from subsidized fuel, which should then pay market. But the overwhelming majority of rakyat will continue to enjoy the same subsidized price.
Now, we can't let you go without talking about the ongoing fiscal reforms. Are we in the final stretch of RON 95 subsidy rationalisation? Or is there still discussion over its implementation, or, this ongoing debate as to whether T5 or T15 should be excluded?
Thank you, Shawnee. As what we've mentioned, the government has been consistent in implementing subsidy targeting, and really the intent there is how do we address the leakage, but at the same time ensuring that the rakyat at large continue to not be unduly affected. And so you've seen that approach with electricity, where more than 80% of households, even over the last couple of years, even when we've adjusted the tariffs for the larger corporates or even the household with a larger consumption, but more than 80% will maintain in terms of not facing increase in price. Even the same approach for diesel, where when the price is increased to market or without subsidy, we've maintained the subsidized price for the logistics sector, so that mitigates potential impact on inflation. But one of the key learnings from the diesel subsidy targeting was that there were certainly significant savings, because obviously previously there were those who were buying diesel from the petrol stations at subsidized prices and using it, whether it's for their gensets in factories or construction sites, or smuggling it across the border. And that's the very leakage that we want to address. So in undertaking for RON 95 subsidy targeting, the Prime Minister committed in the budget at least 85%. That might even be higher, whether 90% or so, because at the end of the day, it's not about taking away subsidies from the rakyat. It's about addressing the leakage at the top end, whether that is foreigners smuggling RON 95 across the border, whether it's commercial, again, taking it for industrial use where they should be paying the price without subsidy, or maybe even the highest income,
Okay, I see where you're coming from, Johan, but the issue here is it seems like the government still wants to have a very subsidy mentality or approach towards finances. And I wonder, in the longer term, is this really going to be very good for our country? Should we not just remove all subsidies? And I'm not saying this without having a layer of social protection at the same time, right? Whether it's a cash handout, more targeted distribution of aid to those who we need. Why aren't we moving along that rather than, some groups get it, some groups don't get it. Let's find out who the T15 are, who the T5. Because this all just adds a layer of complexity to something, doesn't it? I mean, shouldn't we just approach this in a very systematic, in a certain simplistic manner?
I think we've spent most of this interview speaking about SST and its potential impact
which is complicated.
on the rakyat.
Yeah.
So I think, it's a very valid concern. So I think it needs to be very clear that, we as a government certainly do not want to be dismissive on the cost of living challenges faced by the rakyat. So as much as possible, whilst we do need to shore up and undertake fiscal reform for the sustainability of the country's finances, we want to do it in a way that tries to mitigate the impact on households in general.
For sure.
So even as some people say, the simplest thing to do with RON 95 is just to put up the price to market and then maybe just try to give a cash handout.
Yeah.
Now, if I give example, even let's say my own colleagues in say Ministry of Finance, right? If I did that, increase the market price and maybe just give out a cash allowance, cash compensation or cash assistance. Typically when you do that, it has to be probably a fixed amount and you probably give that fixed amount based on some average consumption. But what happens then is that my colleagues who live in Putrajaya quarters are probably quite happy because they probably get more than they need. Whereas I have colleagues who stay as far as Seremban, and certainly based on some average cash allowance, that won't be enough to compensate for their increase in costs. And what more, it's a double whammy because those who tend to live further away from work tend to be the lower middle classes. And so I think this simplistic approach, let's just increase the market price and just give a flat cash allowance, actually potentially is very regressive. So I think that's why the government first focus is that, look, we must accept that in our system, there are leakages. By even addressing the leakages already, we can achieve significant savings without being detrimental to the average household. So let's focus on that first and try to mitigate the impact on the rakyat.
Now, what is the government doing on its part when it comes to spending? We mentioned it slightly before the break, but yet we are still waiting for this Government Procurement Act. Nobody likes to be shackled, but what's the delay?
No, certainly undertaking a Government Procurement Act requires a lot of engagement because the procurement policies not just affect federal government, it also then cascades down to the state government and also local councils and statutory bodies. So I think that's something that there's been a lot of engagement. It's still certainly on track, on target to implement the Procurement Act this year. But I have to say that from the get-go, from the start of the Madani government, Prime Minister has been very consistent in not allowing for direct negotiated contracts. Obviously, there are some exceptions for military and security procurement, but whereas in the past, it was very commonplace to perhaps give out direct negotiated contracts for simple roads, clinics or schools, that certainly is not the case. There's not been any direct negotiated contracts for simple projects.
We also have Auditor General and our PAC coming up with the report saying, hey, this government department hasn't done very well with its spending, they've overspent. What is the government doing on that front? Because it just makes the rakyat very annoyed, right? Asking us to pay more tax. But then on the other hand, it doesn't look like the government itself is doing its part.
I guess I wanted to articulate that certainly there has been efforts. So in terms of transitioning from a norm of direct negotiated to now ensuring that all projects that can be tendered are tendered is certainly a key shift that's been undertaken by the government. Have we addressed leakage and corruption? We have to admit, no, it's certainly still work in progress. And I also must credit my colleagues in MyCC who have also identified that someone other, maybe this is how, whether it's the private sector contractors or suppliers, they obviously can be quite creative. And MyCC has identified somewhere as we transition to more tenders, we've also seen some tenders that obviously have been, I'm not sure what right word.
Colluded?
Rigged. Maybe
rigged.
Is the right term, where somehow or another they are able to, work the system either by ensuring that, technical specs are slanted towards particular suppliers, or where the participating tenderers have somehow or another colluded to try to get the desired outcome. So certainly these are areas that, we certainly are keen to step up. In fact, in terms of even the allocation resources of MyCC, the Procurement Act is also part of tightening up in terms of these potential leakages. But again, the direction is clear.
Okay.
We do want to address procurement leakages and get best value for money for the government's funds.
Okay, but at the same time, it feels like the middle class are being asked again to bear the brunt of this extended SST, and I think in many ways the past financial mismanagement of the country. So what message do you have for them? Because they're going to, come July 1st, find out that a lot of things are more expensive.
Actually, Xiaoning, interestingly enough, I think you're against the middle classes more than me. And the reason I say that is that actually when you think about it, subsidies, you think about electricity subsidies, petrol subsidies, it's actually not B40. the B40, if he uses a motorcycle, uses very minimal.
Very minimal. It's the M40.
So actually maintaining this current structure of trying to safeguard the subsidies, and again, Prime Minister specifically said, not B40, for RON 95 for electricity, he always says it's the 80%, 90%. It's actually the subsidies in trying to structure, some have said a complicated way of structuring, whether it's the RON 95 diesel or electricity, is actually a complicated way of trying to also safeguard the impact on cost of living for the middle classes. So it's not to say that, and every time we have a budget, people tend to focus on the cash assistance. But every budget we've also looked at, even there were revisions in the tax rates. Whenever we refine in some terms of the deductions that we announce in the annual budget, that's all geared towards the middle classes. So certainly the government doesn't forget the middle classes, and certainly the way in which we approach subsidies is very much having the middle class in mind.
Okay, Johan, one question about how do you think our economy is doing? And you probably have a better sense of it than most people. How are we balancing our books? How worried are you over this new world order with unknown tariffs and a potential global slowdown? Do we have the buffers if the economy drastically decelerates, since we've just recovered from that massive pandemic spend?
I know it's actually the developments can be quite depressing.
Sometimes.
I think we were all really having a wave of optimism when you look at 2024. We saw our GDP grow 5.1%, exceeding our earlier target of 4 to 5%. Even our deficit was able to come down at 4.1%, better than our target of 4.3%. Unemployment in December was at 3.1%, probably the lowest in about 10 years. It was all looking good in terms of very strong momentum going into 2025. And then
Trump.
You said it. So I think the issue right now is that whilst even first quarter numbers, continue to be robust and there's still some momentum, and maybe some people have said there's some front loading of exports, certainly it is of great concern. It's not just in terms of just our direct trade to markets like the US. It's also the inherent uncertainty of global policies, and even in terms of geopolitical developments such as in the Middle East, it just creates such an uncertainty, and that potentially will be detrimental on investment decisions, consumption decisions. And that obviously, we accept that there would obviously be potentially an impact on our growth this year and next. We continue to monitor the situation very closely, but that's the very reason why measures such as SST are required to also give us some fiscal space so we are able to react if things do deteriorate. And it's just a situation where there's just so much uncertainty. I think it's best that we are prepared. But having said that, there are already some measures that we've started to take, and you may have heard of Gear Up. YB Minister of Finance too is personally leading that on how do we better optimize on the liquidity and capability of our GLICs. How do we then ensure that we channel some of it towards domestic direct investment in support of the economy Madani transformation. We see also, we see a lot of dynamism in the startups in Malaysia. How do we ensure that they have the sufficient funds and support institutionally to also grow? So certainly there are those efforts to mitigate from these external uncertainties.
30 seconds. What can we expect for Budget 2026 on October 10?
You just have to wait, Chao Ning, for budget. But certainly, we need to, especially in the context of these global uncertainties, and we continue to monitor it, we certainly want to ensure that the government is there in place, having the capability and resources to ensure that we continue to safeguard the well-being of the rakyat, and ensure that we continue to support from a fiscal policy that's supportive of continued growth and development for the country.
Safe answer, Johan. On that note, thank you for your time. Today on the Breakfast Grille was Datuk Johan Mahmood Merican, Secretary General of Treasury Ministry of Finance. I'm Wong Shao Ning, BFM 89.9.
Thank you, Shao Ning.